Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hey Herman and Corin. So there's been enough going on in my life over the past couple of months and in our neck of the woods from a news standpoint that I haven't really even had a chance to look beyond the very surface of some of the other things that have dominated the news headlines. And there's been a number of dynamics happening in the US and around the world that I don't really have a good read on because I just haven't. I guess I always prioritize understanding news that can affect where I live here in Israel above that in other parts of the world. But one of those issues, and maybe this can be the start of our series, a start of a series in which we give an overview of news issues for those who, like me, maybe just haven't had a chance to look into a topic yet. That's this whole thing about Donald Trump and Greenland. It just seems so bizarre on the surface. It's almost like a joke. What else could be? What other strange concerns in an era of so much else happening, so much better uses for our leaders' time than the US is suddenly fixated on Greenland, of all places. I know virtually nothing about Greenland. I'm guessing most people are in a pretty similar boat. It's a big place. Denmark has a territorial claim to it. And it's sparsely populated for obvious reasons because it's not easy to live in such an unforgiving climate. But, you know, there has been, needless to say, if we looked at a search graph for interest in Greenland, I'm guessing we'd see a very big spike in the past few months. And the US and other countries just often have their military bases in the strangest of places. We're seeing some examples of Russia carving new routes over the Arctic, and I guess I just always assumed there was nothing going on up in those parts of the world, the poles namely, except some polar bears, the occasional very intrepid explorer, but to see that there's actually military bases. I mean, some of these places some of the countries that extend to the pole, the North Pole, I believe Greenland's one of them. Canada is a country that people forget how far north it extends. Really crazy. And the Canadian Army have some installations in a place called Remote. That's literally the name of it. I can't even begin to think how one goes about surviving living in a place like that. But it changed my view of the poles, reading these episodes, from being these just desolate wildernesses where essentially nothing happens, to suddenly they're actually geopolitically very significant. And you've got Russia, the US, and others having very specific interests in parts of the world that you just look at on a map and say, why would you possibly care? There's nothing there. But there's clearly more to it than meets the eye. So Herman and Corin, I'd love to chat today about what's actually going on up there in the North Pole. Why does the US suddenly care so much about Greenland? And what's happening with the Russians and all these stations? It's not just research going on in those freezing conditions. And finally, how do you live up there? The people who are in these extreme places, I assume their bodies just adjust. But maybe let's keep it on the actual operational stuff and the specific case of the US's interest. Herman and Corin, give me a catch up, please. Why is Donald Trump and the US suddenly interested in Greenland? And who's living over there? Over to you two.
You know, Herman, I was looking at a map of the world the other day, one of those standard Mercator projections we all grew up with in elementary school, and I realized just how much our entire geopolitical perspective is skewed by the way we project a sphere onto a flat piece of paper. We tend to see Greenland as this massive distorted white blob at the top of the world that just sort of sits there, isolated and empty, like a frozen afterthought. But if you shift your perspective to a polar projection, where the North Pole is the literal center of the map, everything changes. Suddenly, the Arctic isn't the edge of the world, it is the center of it. Greenland stops looking like a peripheral island and starts looking like the ultimate piece of high ground real estate, a massive fortress guarding the gateway between the Atlantic and the Pacific.
Herman Poppleberry here, and Korn, you have hit on the fundamental optical illusion of modern geography. It is the literal crown of the northern hemisphere, and for centuries we ignored it because it was functionally inaccessible. But it is funny you mention the map, because that is exactly why today's prompt from Daniel is so timely. He wanted us to dig into the whole Donald Trump and Greenland situation, which, as of February 2026, has moved from a bizarre headline to a central pillar of North Atlantic security strategy. On the surface, when it first broke back in 2019, it sounded like a headline from a satirical news site, right? An American president wanting to buy a massive icy island from the Kingdom of Denmark. But once you peel back the layers of the geopolitical onion, you realize it is not a joke at all. It is actually a very calculated, if somewhat blunt, recognition of where the world is heading in the next 50 years.
Right, and it is not just a one-off comment or a social media post anymore. Since the mid-2020s, we have seen a sustained, almost frantic spike in interest in the region. We are seeing military bases being reactivated, new shipping routes being carved through the thinning ice, and a literal race for resources that were previously locked under 2 miles of prehistoric glaciers. Daniel asked why the United States is suddenly so interested, what Russia is up to with their futuristic-looking stations, and who actually lives in these places. And honestly, I think we should start with the why. Why now? Why did this jump from a fringe 19th century expansionist idea to a major diplomatic talking point that is dominating headlines today in 2026?
Well, to understand the why, we have to look at the where and the when. For the duration of the Cold War, the Arctic was basically a frozen buffer zone. It was important, sure, but primarily because it was the shortest path for nuclear missiles to travel between the United States and the Soviet Union. That is why we have the Patufic Space Base, which listeners might remember was called Thule Air Base for decades, way up in the northwest of Greenland. It was a tripwire, a place for radar to scan the skies. But after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the Arctic became a bit of a backwater. The world's eyes shifted to the Middle East and then to the South China Sea. People stopped paying attention to the ice.
Until the ice started disappearing.
Exactly. Climate change is the primary driver of this entire conversation. As the polar ice caps recede at a rate that has shocked even the most pessimistic climate models from 10 years ago, the Arctic is transforming from a solid, impenetrable barrier into an open, navigable ocean. This opens up 2 massive, world-altering opportunities. The first is transit. The Northern Sea route along the Russian coast and the Northwest Passage through the Canadian Arctic can cut shipping times between Asia and Europe by as much as 40%. Think about that, Korn. If you are a shipping conglomerate in 2026 and you can bypass the Suez Canal, avoiding the bottlenecks, the regional instability, and the massive transit fees, and save 10 to 15 days of fuel and labor, you do it every single time. It is the greatest shift in global trade routes since the opening of the Panama Canal.
And Greenland sits right at the exit of those routes. It is like the toll booth at the end of a very long, very cold highway. If you control Greenland, you control the choke point of the North Atlantic. But it is not just about the ships passing by, is it? There is also the treasure chest that is being revealed as the ice melts.
That is the second piece of the puzzle, and it is arguably more important for the long-term survival of the high-tech economy. Greenland is estimated to hold about 10% of the world's fresh water, which is a strategic asset in itself, but more importantly, it is incredibly rich in minerals. We are talking about gold, rubies, uranium, and the big one, rare earth elements, neodymium, praseodymium, dysprosium, terbium. These are the things we need for electric vehicle motors, wind turbines, high-capacity batteries, and advanced military hardware like F-35 fighter jets and guided missile systems. Currently, China controls about 80 to 90% of the global supply chain for these materials. They have a virtual monopoly. So, if you are the United States, looking at a future where you are competing with China for technological dominance, having a massive untapped source of rare earths right in your own backyard, or at least within your sphere of influence, is not just a nice to have. It is a strategic necessity.
I remember reading about the Kvanefjeld project in southern Greenland. It is one of the largest undeveloped deposits of rare earth elements and uranium in the entire world. And for a while, a Chinese company, Shanghai Resources, was the largest shareholder in the firm developing it. That had to have set off some major alarm bells in the Pentagon and the State Department.
Oh, it absolutely did. It was the Sputnik moment for Arctic mineral policy. The United States realized that if they did not step up their presence, Greenland could effectively become a Chinese outpost in the middle of the North Atlantic. In 2018, the Danish government, with some very heavy nudging from Washington, actually stepped in to fund several new international airports in Greenland because a Chinese state-owned company was the front-runner for the contract. The United States basically told Denmark, "We cannot let China build the infrastructure that controls access to the Arctic." Since then, the U.S. has reopened its consulate in Newark and has been pouring millions of dollars into economic development packages. It is a soft power offensive that we haven't seen in this region since the 1940s.
It is fascinating because it is almost like a modern-day application of the Monroe Doctrine. The United States is essentially saying that the Arctic is part of its security perimeter, and that foreign powers, particularly China and Russia, need to be kept at a distance. But let's talk about Russia for a second, because Daniel specifically asked about their stations. We have seen these photos of Arctic trefoil bases, these futuristic, shamrock-shaped structures painted in the bright white, blue, and red of the Russian flag. They look like something out of a science fiction movie set on a frozen planet. What are they actually doing up there in 2026?
Russia is currently much further ahead in the Arctic race than anyone else, and it is not even close. They view the Arctic as their future counting house, as Putin once called it. They have the world's largest fleet of icebreakers, over 40 of them, including several massive nuclear-powered ones like the Arctica class that can smash through ice that is 3 meters thick. For comparison, the United States has 2 aging icebreakers, only one of which is a heavy icebreaker. Russia has been systematically reopening and modernizing over a dozen Soviet-era military bases across their northern coastline. The Nagorskoye Air Base on Alexandra Land is the crown jewel. It is the northernmost military installation in Russia, and they have built a massive all-weather runway there that can handle heavy long-range bombers and MiG-31 interceptors year-round.
And the goal there is what? Is it purely defensive, or is it about projecting power over those new shipping routes we talked about?
It is a dual-purpose strategy. Russia views the Northern Sea Route as their national waterway, almost like an internal canal. They want to be able to tax the ships that use it, provide the ice-breaking services for a fee, and protect the massive oil and liquefied natural gas projects they have in the Yamal Peninsula. But there is also a deeper, more Cold War-style strategic layer called the Bastion concept. The idea is to create a safe zone in the Arctic for their nuclear ballistic missile submarines. If they can control the waters and the airspace around the North Pole, they have a secure place to hide their second strike capability. By placing S-400 missile systems and advanced electronic warfare units on these Arctic islands, they are essentially creating a no-go zone for NATO forces. They are turning the Arctic Ocean into a Russian lake.
So when the U.S. talks about Greenland, even if the phrasing about buying, it was unconventional, it is a direct response to this massive buildup on the other side of the pole. If Russia is fortifying their side, the United States feels it needs to fortify its side to maintain the balance of power. But Greenland isn't just a giant military base or a mine. It is a country with its own people, a rich culture, and a very complex relationship with Denmark.
Right, and this is where the who comes in. Greenland is an autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark. They have their own parliament, called the Inatsisartut, and control over most of their internal affairs like education, health, and the environment. However, Denmark still handles their foreign policy and defense, and provides a massive annual subsidy, the block grant that accounts for about half of the Greenlandic government's budget. The population is small, only about 56,000 people, and about 90% of them are Greenlandic Inuit. Their perspective is often completely lost in this great game talk between superpowers. For them, the melting ice isn't just a shipping opportunity, it is a fundamental threat to their traditional way of life, their hunting grounds, and their food security.
That leads perfectly into Daniel's other question: who is actually living in these extreme conditions? I mean, we are talking about places where the sun doesn't rise for months during the polar night, and the temperature can drop to minus 60 degrees Celsius with wind chill. How do you even function in a place like that?
It takes a very specific kind of resilience to thrive there. You can generally categorize the inhabitants into three main groups. First, you have the indigenous population, the Inuit, who have lived there for thousands of years. They have a deep cultural understanding of the environment that Western scientists are only just beginning to fully appreciate. Their traditional knowledge about ice patterns, animal migrations, and weather signs is often more accurate than satellite data. They live in towns like Newark, the capital, which has about 19,000 people. It is a modern city with cafes, high-speed internet, and a university, but it is also incredibly isolated. You cannot drive from Newark to any other town. There are no roads connecting the settlements in Greenland. If you want to go to the next village, you have to take a boat, a helicopter, or a small plane.
That is wild to think about. A capital city where you are effectively on an island within an island. What about the military personnel? I imagine their life is very different.
That is the second group. Take Patuxent Space Base, for example. It is about 750 miles north of the Arctic Circle. There are usually around 600 people there at any given time, a mix of United States Space Force personnel, Danish military, and civilian contractors. It is like living on a space station that happens to be on Earth. Everything is self-contained. They have their own power plant, their own water treatment system, and a massive hangar that serves as a community center with a bowling alley and a gym. The psychological toll of the polar night is a huge factor. From October to February, it is pitch black 24 hours a day. They have to use special high-intensity light therapy and keep people on strict schedules to prevent seasonal affective disorder and Arctic stare, a kind of dissociative state that can happen in extreme isolation.
And then there's the third group, right? The researchers and those specialized units that sound like they belong in a Tom Clancy novel.
Yes, and this is where it gets really fascinating. You have places like Station Nord in northeast Greenland. It is a Danish military and scientific station manned by only 5 Danish soldiers year-round, though that number swells in the summer. Their main job is to maintain the runway and keep a Danish presence in that totally uninhabited part of the country. But the real legends of the Arctic are the Sirius Dog Sled Patrol or Slottepatruljen Sirius.
Oh, I've heard of them. They are like the elite of the elite, right? The only military unit in the world that uses dog sleds as their primary transport.
Exactly. They are a unit of the Danish Navy, and they patrol the entire coastline of the Northeast Greenland National Park. To give you an idea of the scale, that park is the largest national park in the world. It is about the size of France and Spain combined, and it is completely uninhabited. There are only 12 men in the unit. They travel in pairs on dog sleds for months at a time, covering thousands of miles in some of the most brutal conditions on the planet. They are the only ones who can effectively monitor that much territory because, as we've seen, technology often fails in that kind of cold. Batteries die, metal becomes brittle and snaps, and satellite signals can be blocked by atmospheric interference or solar flares.
It is amazing that in 2026, with all our drones and AI-driven surveillance, the most effective way to patrol the Arctic is still 2 guys and a team of 12 Greenland dogs. But it speaks to how unforgiving the environment is. If you get into trouble out there, there is no quick response team. You are on your own.
And that is why the land itself is so valuable. You can't just float a carrier group in the Arctic and expect it to work year-round. The ice will eventually crush the hull or trap the ships. You need permanent, land-based infrastructure. That is why Greenland is often called the unsinkable aircraft carrier of the North Atlantic. If you control Greenland, you control the access points. You can monitor every submarine moving through the GIUK gap, that's the Greenland, Iceland, and United Kingdom gap, which is the primary route for Russian subs to enter the Atlantic.
So, when we look back at the Trump proposal from 2019 and the renewed interest we are seeing now in the mid-20s, it wasn't just a whim. It was a clumsy attempt to secure a strategic asset that the United States has actually tried to buy before. Didn't Harry Truman try to buy it in 1946?
He did. After World War II, the United States offered Denmark $100 million in gold for the island. Denmark said no, but they did allow the United States to build the bases that eventually became Pituffik. The United States has always recognized Greenland's importance. In fact, there is a secret history here that most people don't know about, something called Project Iceworm. In the 1960s, the U.S. military started building a network of mobile nuclear missile launch sites under the Greenland ice sheet. They built a city under the ice called Camp Century, powered by a portable nuclear reactor. The idea was to have 600 missiles that could be moved on rails under the ice so the Soviets wouldn't know where they were.
Wait, a nuclear-powered city under the ice? That sounds like a Bond villain's lair. What happened to it?
The ice happened. They realized that the glaciers are not static, they are constantly moving and shifting. The tunnels started collapsing, and they had to abandon the project in 1967. But the kicker is that they left the nuclear waste and the infrastructure there, thinking it would be frozen forever. Now, with the ice melting, that waste is potentially going to be exposed in the coming decades. It is a literal cold case of environmental and diplomatic tension.
It is funny how history repeats itself, but the stakes just keep getting higher. Back in '46, it was about stopping the Soviets. Now, it is a multipolar struggle involving Russia, China, the US, and even the European Union. Everyone wants a piece of the new North. But what about the Greenlanders themselves? You mentioned an independence movement.
This is the wild card. There is a very strong and growing independence movement in Greenland. Many people there want to eventually break away from Denmark entirely and become the world's first sovereign Inuit nation. But to do that, they have to solve a massive mathematical problem. How do you replace the $500 million a year that Denmark gives them? The only way to do that is through large-scale mining and tourism. So, they are in this incredibly difficult position. Do they allow massive open-pit mines for rare earth elements, which might destroy the very wilderness and hunting grounds that define their culture in order to gain their political freedom? Or do they remain a territory dependent on a country thousands of miles away to protect their environment?
That is a classic dilemma of development versus preservation, but played out in the most extreme environment on Earth. And you can bet that every major power is trying to influence that decision. I've seen reports of China offering to build research stations that look suspiciously like dual-use facilities, and the US offering economic aid that comes with strings attached regarding who gets the mining contracts.
It is a soft power war happening on top of a hard power buildup, and Russia is playing its own game. Beyond the military aspect, they are building the Polar Express, a massive fiber optic cable along their entire northern coast. They say it is for improving internet connectivity for their northern cities, but it also gives the Russian military a secure, high-speed communication network that is nearly impossible for NATO to intercept or cut. They are building a digital iron curtain across the top of the world.
It is a total transformation of the region. It used to be a place of exploration and science, a place where the Arctic Council was a model of international cooperation. Even during the height of the Cold War, scientists from the United States and the Soviet Union worked together on ice core samples and weather tracking. But that seems to be breaking down completely in 2026.
It really is. After the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the other 7 members of the Arctic Council, Canada, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and the US, basically stopped working with Russia. That is a huge problem because Russia controls about half of the Arctic coastline. You cannot effectively manage the Arctic environment, track oil spills, or coordinate search and rescue without Russia. This has led to a situation where the Arctic is being split into 2 camps, the Arctic 7 versus Russia, and its junior partner in the north, China.
That is a dangerous combination. Russia has the geography and the icebreakers, and China has the capital and the technology. If they form a polar alliance, it completely changes the security calculus for North America. If you are sitting in Washington or Ottawa, you are looking at the North Pole not as a barrier, but as a front line.
And that brings us back to why the United States is so fixated on Greenland. If you lose influence in Greenland, you lose your ability to counter that alliance in the North Atlantic. It is not just about buying an island like it's a piece of real estate on a monopoly board, it is about maintaining a presence in a region that is becoming the new center of global competition. It is about the minerals in your phone, the route your Christmas presents take on a cargo ship, and the security of the entire northern hemisphere.
So, what are the practical takeaways for our listeners? If someone is looking at these headlines about Trump and Greenland, or Russian Arctic bases, and wondering how it actually affects their daily life, what should they keep in mind?
First, understand that the Arctic is no longer a remote wilderness. It is a major economic corridor in the making. Within the next decade, the products you buy from Asia might very well be arriving via the North Pole rather than the Suez Canal. Second, the rare earth issue is a matter of national security. The transition to green energy, the electric cars we drive, and the wind turbines that power our homes depends entirely on these minerals. Greenland is one of the only places on Earth that can break the Chinese monopoly on those materials. The geopolitical struggle over Greenland is, in many ways, a struggle over the future of technology itself.
And third, I would say, keep an eye on the WHO. The people living in these conditions are at the forefront of the most rapid climate and political change on the planet. Whether it is the Inuit in Newark trying to navigate the path to independence, or the soldiers at Patuxent monitoring the skies for hypersonic missiles, their lives are being directly impacted by decisions made in Washington, Moscow, and Beijing. We shouldn't just look at Greenland as a prize. It is a living, breathing place with a very uncertain future.
Well said, Korn. It is a fascinating, if somewhat chilling, topic. It shows that even the most bizarre headlines usually have a very real, very serious foundation if you dig deep enough into the ice.
Absolutely. And Herman, I have to say your knowledge of the Sirius Dog Sled Patrol is impressive. I assume you've already applied for a position? I can see you in a parka, mushing across the tundra.
Ha! I think I'll stick to the Jerusalem climate for now. I don't think my beard would handle the -60 very well. I'd probably end up looking like a human popsicle within 20 minutes.
Herman Popsicleberry. I like it. It has a certain ring to it.
Let's not make that a thing, Korn, please.
Too late. It's in the script now. Anyway, that was a great deep dive. Daniel, thanks for the prompt. It really forced us to look at the top of the world in a whole new way. It's not just a white blob on the map. It's the future of global power.
Definitely. And to our listeners, if you are enjoying these deep dives into the weird, the significant, and the strategically icy, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It genuinely helps the show grow and reach more curious minds who want to know what's really going on behind the headlines.
Yeah, it makes a huge difference. You can also find us at myweirdprompts.com for our full archive and a way to get in touch. We love hearing your thoughts and your own weird prompts.
You can also email us at show@myweirdprompts.com. We are available on all major podcast platforms from the tropics to the Arctic Circle.
This has been My Weird Prompts. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.
Goodbye, everyone. Stay warm.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.